Good evening. You're tuned to Hopium Radio. Tonight, Michael Saylor, speaking at Cantor Fitzgerald, a thesis on Bitcoin and shifting political tide. Settle in, turn it up, and now, Michael Saylor.
So today you're going to hear me talk about a few things you might have heard before, but they're now refreshed, and then you're going to hear me speak about a few things I've never spoken about before, which I think will be interesting to the group. But I'll start with the problem that we all know. The economic problem is that very few asset classes outperform monetary inflation. If you're trying to beat the cost of capital, the S&P index, it's very, very challenging to do it. And everybody in the world is looking for a solution to this problem. The companies don't have a solution. If the company can't grow 15% a year or more, institutional investors lose interest, liquidity in the stock dries up, there is no options market. And companies are required by normal treasury rules to use US treasuries as their capital asset. And if a company is sitting on top of treasury bills, they're losing 10% of their capital a year. They're underperforming the cost of capital by 10%. $100 billion of capital is going to cost your shareholders $10 billion a year. So companies are, in essence, type 1 diabetics. Every company with a treasury strategy is a diabetic. You're in essence bleeding capital off your balance sheet. And of course, intelligent CEOs or CFOs understand that, so their solution, of course, is just give away all the money. Like, we give away the capital. We buy the stock back and we lever up 144 to 1, or I dividend it out. But the solution of my wealth is toxic, so I'm going to give it all away is, in my opinion, not a recipe for living happily ever after. And that's what we do to most operating companies. There's a political problem. The political problem is, how do we grow the economy of the United States? How do we deliver prosperity to our people? And how do we overcome a deficit? And all that while maintaining global leadership. So everyone, every institution, every investor, every company, every politician is struggling with these problems today. Bitcoin's the solution. Why is it the solution? Is it the solution? A lot of people are wondering that. Well, I'll put the Bitcoin return for the last 4 years on this chart I just showed you, and you can see Bitcoin is just punching a hole in all the traditional capital markets. This isn't 1 year or 2 years. This is 4 years, but you know, it happens to be the 4 years since MicroStrategy decided Bitcoin was the solution. And you might say, well, you cherry-picked that number. That's the low number. I cherry-picked that number because the other numbers are better, and I'll show you that in a second. If we look at this entire set of asset classes, they line up kind of elegantly. If you're actually holding bonds for the last 4 years, you lost 5% of your capital a year. They're losers. Every bank in the US is capitalized on bonds. Every operating company is capitalized on bonds. You wonder why the banks are sick? You wonder why the operating companies are sick? They're sitting on those minus 5% instruments, and that's their best idea. Gold's plus 6%. You might as well just hold gold. Real estate's plus 10%. The S&P's 15%. You can double it with the Magnificent Seven. Find the best companies in the S&P, the NVIDIAs, the Apples, the Googles. 29%. And this little creature we call Bitcoin is doubling that, 60%. And when you look at that chart, a lot of things become pretty clear. But this is the past 14 years. Bitcoin's not just winning. I mean, it's up 78% in 8 years. It's up 103% in 12 years. It's up 168% in 14 years. It's consistently winning, and at some point, if you look at the numbers, you start to wonder, well, why is it winning, and is this a fluke? And the irony, of course, is that you still get questions from the normies every day, like, well, when does the run stop? It's like, when do nuclear reactors stop producing more electricity than water wheels? You know, when does the airplane stop flying faster than the donkey cart? The answer is it's not going to stop because it's structural and technical. Everyone in the world is searching for an asset uncorrelated to the S&P 500. with higher returns. Uncorrelated and performing. It's the holy grail. Banks have conferences on this stuff. Well, Bitcoin is that asset. It's an asset without the counterparty risk that comes from competitors, countries, corporations, creditors, cultures, or currencies. Everything else you own in your life has a counterparty risk to one of those items, except Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, in essence, orthogonal to the rest of the market. That makes it alpha. But you don't have to believe it from first principles. You don't have to study it. You can just look at the data. This is fidelity data. It's showing the lack of correlation and the Sharpe ratio. It's got the highest Sharpe ratio. It's got the lowest correlation. So even if you haven't read the book, The Bitcoin Standard, even if you haven't thought about it for 100 hours or 1,000 hours or 10 hours, all you have to do is just run the numbers. The market is screaming at you that it's an uncorrelated, high-performing asset. But to truly understand it, you have to go back to first principles. And this is my alma mater, MIT, and this is where I was taught to think from first principles, and they taught you how to build things that had never been built before and solve problems that had never been solved before. And it was an epiphany that you're actually expected and capable of solving problems no human being on the face of the earth has ever solved before. I mean, Elon Musk keeps pointing this out and proving it, and that's why he's the richest man in the world. The capital markets are full of people doing the same thing over and over again the same way because convention says to do it the same way. I'm suggesting you apply basic physics and engineering to capital markets and see if you can solve the problem in a new way. This is the wealth in the world. It's distributed across real estate and bonds and equity, and the little block in the lower left corner is Bitcoin at 1.8 trillion. When, incidentally, when MicroStrategy got into this, Bitcoin was 180 billion. So we have 10x'd, and that's just in 4 years. But here's another way to see that chart. And this is the most profound insight of the day I'm going to give you, that I think the majority of rich people and the majority of corporations and the majority of money managers still don't get this one idea, which is half of the wealth in the world is invested in assets in search of a long-term store of value. People just want to engage in long-term capital preservation. Another way to say it is, I just want to stay rich. I want to keep my money. There's no one you'll meet that doesn't want to keep their money, right? There's no government, there's no corporation, there's no wealthy person, there's no poor person. Nobody wants to lose their money. So the circle on the right is $450 trillion blob of long-term capital, right? Next time you hear someone say, well, what's the Bitcoin use case? There's no use case. The use case is the most valuable thing in the entire human race. It's $450 trillion. It's all the capital in the world. The use case is you get to keep your money, right? That's actually the epiphany. Once you understand that people are using assets for two reasons, long-term capital preservation, or the second reason is utility. Your yacht, your jet, your bakery, your farm, your ranch, your plane, company, that's utility value. Your piece of art you put on the wall, it's utility. Half this stuff is for utility, the other half is capital preservation.
And that concludes the first part of Michael Saylor's address. Tune in for the next one as we continue until the speech is finished, following the thesis to its next crescendo, right here on Hopium Radio.
This is Hopium Radio, your #1 radio station, your favorite source of dopamine hits for your Bitcoin bullishness. Broadcasting every day on the internet, where every dip is healthy, every pump is inevitable, and every chart is somehow confirming the thesis. No financial advice, just conviction and bull speeches strong enough to make you whisper, "I'm never selling," like it's a bedtime prayer. So whether you're up 12% and feeling chosen, or down 25% and suddenly a philosopher, you're in the right place. Lock in, turn it up, and stack sats responsibly, irresponsibly, because because you're tuned in to Hopium Radio, where the signal is strong and the positivity is borderline toxic.
You're listening to Hopium Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's speech comes from the quiet frontier of Bitcoin's beginning, Hal Finney. A legendary cryptographer and early cypherpunk, Hal was among the first to run Bitcoin software, and the first person beyond Satoshi to receive a Bitcoin transaction. What follows isn't hype, it's history told with grace.
I want to tell you about the last few years, eventful years for Bitcoin. My name is Hal Finney. I came up through cryptography, early PGP, the cypherpunks, and some of the first experiments in privacy and digital cash. So when Bitcoin appeared in late 2008, I paid attention. A lot of veteran cryptographers were skeptical. They'd seen too many grand ideas fall apart. But I felt something different here. I had followed the work of people like Wade Dye and Nick Szabo. I had even tried building my own proof-of-work system. When Satoshi released the software, I downloaded it immediately. I may have been the first person, besides Satoshi, to run it. I mined a few early blocks, and I received the first Bitcoin transaction, 10 coins, sent as a simple test. For a few days, it was just code, conversation, and curiosity, me reporting bugs, Satoshi fixing them. Back then, you could mine with an ordinary CPU. Difficulty was low. It was quiet, almost innocent. I turned it off eventually. My computer ran hot and the fan noise got annoying. Looking back, you can imagine the what if, but I was there at the beginning, and that's its own kind of fortune. Then, in 2010, I looked again, amazed that Bitcoin was still alive and that it had value. I found my old wallet and moved those coins into cold storage, something I hoped would one day help my family, because in 2009, my life changed. I had been in the best shape I'd ever been, running long distances, training for a marathon, when my body began to fail. My speech slurred. My hands weakened. Recovery became harder. And in August of that year, I was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. ALS is relentless. It weakens, then it paralyzes. Many don't get much time. I kept working for a while, but eventually I had to retire. Today, I live with a wheelchair, feeding tubes, assisted breathing. I use an eye tracking system to control my computer. This synthetic voice is how I speak now. And still, life can be good. I can read. I can listen to music. I can watch films. And slowly I can even code again. Painfully slow, but meaningful. I've been working on ways to make Bitcoin wallets safer, using modern hardware security. Bitcoin's price swings, those are entertaining in their own way. I've lived through crashes before. Easy come, easy go, but the real lesson is quieter. Plan for the people you love. Inheritance isn't theoretical when time is limited. My coins are stored safely. My children are capable, and I'm at peace with that. That's my story.
In a world obsessed with loud victories, Hal shows us a quiet one, the choice to keep going. We'll continue in the next part, tuned to Hopium Radio.
For this session, we'll hear one of the simplest, yet most on-point explanations of Bitcoin delivered by Peter van Valkenburgh. On October 11th, 2018, the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs held an open hearing titled Exploring the Cryptocurrency and Blockchain Ecosystem, featuring testimony from Dr. Nouriel Roubini, NYU Stern, and Van Valkenburgh, Director of Research at Coin Center. This is a classic speech. And now, Peter van Valkenburgh.
Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Brown, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Peter van Valkenburgh, and I'm the Director of Research at Coin Center, an independent nonprofit focused on the public policy issues affecting cryptocurrency and public blockchain networks. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the world's first cryptocurrency, and it works because of the world's first public blockchain network. What does Bitcoin do? It's simple. It lets you send and receive value to and from anyone in the world using nothing more than a computer and an internet connection. Now, why is it revolutionary? Because unlike every other tool for sending money over the internet, it works without the need to trust a middleman. The lack of any corporation in between means that Bitcoin is the world's first public digital payments infrastructure. And by public, I simply mean available to all and not owned by any single entity. Now, we have public infrastructure for information, for websites, for email. It's called the internet. But the only public payments infrastructure that we have is cash, as in paper money. And it only works in face-to-face transactions. Before Bitcoin, if you wanted to pay someone remotely over the phone or the internet, then you could not use public infrastructure. You would rely on a private bank to open their books and add a ledger entry that debits you and credits the person you're paying. And if you both don't use the same bank, well, then there'll be multiple banks and multiple ledger entries in between. With Bitcoin, the ledger is the public blockchain, and anyone can add an entry to that ledger, transferring their Bitcoins to someone else. And anyone, regardless of their nationality, race, religion, gender, sex, or creditworthiness, can for absolutely no cost create a Bitcoin address in order to receive payments digitally. Bitcoin is the world's first globally accessible public money. Is it perfect? No. Neither was email when it was invented in 1972. Bitcoin's not the best money on every margin. It's not yet accepted everywhere. It's not used often to quote prices, and it's not always a stable store of value. But it is working, and the mere fact that it works without trusted intermediaries is amazing. It's a computer science breakthrough, and it will be as significant for freedom, prosperity, and human flourishing as the birth of the internet. And Bitcoin is just the beginning. If we can replace private payments infrastructure, then we can replace other private choke points to human interaction as well. Now, why should we want to build more public infrastructure? Why should we embrace blockchains over corporate intermediaries? Why should we tolerate their inefficiencies and work to make them better? Why should we want the pioneers of this technology here in the United States and not fleeing overseas? A simple reason. Because the corporate intermediaries providing today's critical but privately owned infrastructure are becoming fewer, larger, and more powerful, and their failures are increasingly grave. So roughly half of all Americans, 143 million people, had their Social Security numbers exposed to hackers because of a breach at Equifax. The SWIFT network has relayed hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions because of hacked member banks in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ecuador, and Russia. The FBI suspects now that the largest of these hacks was perpetrated by North Korea. Corrupt, low-level employees at an Indian bank, Punjab National, were able to fraudulently certify SWIFT messages stealing $1.8 billion. It's the largest electronic bank robbery in history. In fact, it's the largest bank robbery in history. In October 2016, an estimated 1.2 million internet-connected devices were hacked and turned into a botnet that for several hours made prominent websites unavailable across Europe and North America, including CNN and Fox News, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Increasingly, physical machines are being connected to the internet to augment their capabilities. They're wired through servers that are owned and maintained by private and trusted intermediaries, the so-called Internet of Things. Pacemakers from St. Jude's Hospital have been hacked. Baby monitors from TrendNet have been hacked. And Jeeps from Jeep have been hacked to the point where they can be remotely commandeered and driven off the road. Now, those vulnerabilities are inescapable in systems that have single points of failure. It doesn't matter if the point of failure is a corporation or if it's a government. There shouldn't be a single point of failure. Similar choke points existed before the internet. If you wanted to deliver a message, you'd have to go through one of 3 television broadcasters or a handful of newspapers. Private corporations are essential, but no critical infrastructure should rely on 1 or 2. The internet removed single points of failure in communications infrastructure and ushered in a wave of competition among new media corporations building on top of its public rails. Blockchains can similarly disintermediate critical payments and IoT infrastructure. The technology is not yet ready to answer all of those questions today, but it is our best hope. And as with the internet in the 1990s, we need a light-touch, pro-innovation policy to ensure that these innovations flourish in America for the benefit and security of all Americans.
And that concludes our broadcast of Peter van Valkenburgh's testimony. Simple, precise, and built to hold up over time. If this one sharpened your conviction, stay tuned for the next session, right here on Hopium Radio.
This is Hopium Radio, your #1 radio station, your favorite source of dopamine hits for your Bitcoin bullishness.
You're listening to Hopium Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's speech comes from the quiet frontier of Bitcoin's beginning, Hal Finney. A legendary cryptographer and early cypherpunk, Hal was among the first to run Bitcoin software, and the first person beyond Satoshi to receive a Bitcoin transaction. What follows isn't hype, it's history told with grace.
I want to tell you about the last few years, eventful years for Bitcoin. My name is Hal Finney. I came up through cryptography, early PGP, the cypherpunks, and some of the first experiments in privacy and digital cash. So when Bitcoin appeared in late 2008, I paid attention. A lot of veteran cryptographers were skeptical. They'd seen too many grand ideas fall apart. But I felt something different here. I had followed the work of people like Wade Dye and Nick Szabo. I had even tried building my own proof-of-work system. When Satoshi released the software, I downloaded it immediately. I may have been the first person, besides Satoshi, to run it. I mined a few early blocks, and I received the first Bitcoin transaction, 10 coins, sent as a simple test. For a few days, it was just code, conversation, and curiosity, me reporting bugs, Satoshi fixing them. Back then, you could mine with an ordinary CPU. Difficulty was low. It was quiet, almost innocent. I turned it off eventually. My computer ran hot and the fan noise got annoying. Looking back, you can imagine the what if, but I was there at the beginning, and that's its own kind of fortune. Then, in 2010, I looked again, amazed that Bitcoin was still alive and that it had value. I found my old wallet and moved those coins into cold storage, something I hoped would one day help my family, because in 2009, my life changed. I had been in the best shape I'd ever been, running long distances, training for a marathon, when my body began to fail. My speech slurred. My hands weakened. Recovery became harder. And in August of that year, I was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. ALS is relentless. It weakens, then it paralyzes. Many don't get much time. I kept working for a while, but eventually I had to retire. Today, I live with a wheelchair, feeding tubes, assisted breathing. I use an eye tracking system to control my computer. This synthetic voice is how I speak now. And still, life can be good. I can read. I can listen to music. I can watch films. And slowly I can even code again. Painfully slow, but meaningful. I've been working on ways to make Bitcoin wallets safer, using modern hardware security. Bitcoin's price swings, those are entertaining in their own way. I've lived through crashes before. Easy come, easy go. But the real lesson is quieter. Plan for the people you love. Inheritance isn't theoretical when time is limited. My coins are stored safely. My children are capable. And I'm at peace with that. That's my story.
In a world obsessed with loud victories, Hal shows us a quiet one. The choice to keep going. We'll continue in the next part, tuned to Hopium Radio.
Tonight's broadcast brings us to Amsterdam, where economist and author Saifedean Ammous delivers a sharp thesis. In the next few minutes, you'll hear a chain reaction unfold, from the gold standard to World War I, from money printers to modern conflict, and why he argues Bitcoin is the clean exit. Settle in.
You're listening to Hopium Radio.
I'm going today to be talking about the topic of my new book, and a lot of it has to do with war, which is a very timely, unfortunately, and topical question to discuss. The relationship between fiat and war in particular, and if you want to understand why fiat does cause a lot of war and why I would say war causes a lot of fiat, we need to go back to Genesis, to the origins of fiat. And the origin of fiat, the Genesis block of fiat, if you want, was World War I. That's when the world really downloaded and installed this malware called fiat money. It happened in World War I. And it's a very important story which a lot of people don't know, which most people don't know, because we only found out the details of how this happened very recently, more than a century after it happened. Everything was hidden, and only recently have we found out about it. And it has not really been incorporated into the historiography of World War I and how World War I happened. But we're going to look at it today. So the key idea here we'll see is that fiat is born in war and it thrives in war. And it was thanks to fiat money that we had the bloodiest century ever in the 20th century. In fact, if you look historically before the 20th century, you see that human civilization was advancing, and generally wars were becoming a little bit less bloody. Even though technology was advancing, wars were less and less bloody and less total. If you look in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you see that increasingly wars were being fought between professional armies in battlefields rather than being total wars of populations against each other and the mass murder, including the mass murder of populations. But that reversed in the 20th century, and war went back to being total, and the normal civilized norms of war that had been developing over centuries were forgotten. In fact, we can also see it from this graph. We see the 20th century a massive outlier in terms of the number of people killed in conflict. And that's expensive. You know, killing people is expensive. If you try and do it at scale, I don't recommend you do it, but if you do try to do it at scale, it is pretty expensive. It's not easy. If you don't have a money printer at home to fund it, you're going to have a bad time. It's not easy to kill a lot of people. Highly recommend you go, if you're going to try it, highly recommend having a fiat money printer. That's why the only people that manage to succeed with this have a fiat money printer. So this is really because of fiat, and it's really, we could say that fiat has created generations of people who think that war is inevitable, it's just something that is always happening, it's always going to happen, and it's only a question of who's fighting who at this point, or who are we fighting at this point, but we have to be at war. That's just what humans do. And, you know, you see this when people say that we're just animals. Animals are always fighting each other, and humans are going to be like that too. But I disagree. In fact, historically, we see that war used to be a lot bigger of a deal than now. Countries didn't just go to war with each other. And wars were between armies in battlefields. And while battlefields raged with conflict, cities continued to function normally. And in fact, cities of warring countries might trade with one another while their militaries were fighting. Because under the gold standard, before fiat money, soldiers were expensive. War was expensive. If you wanted to launch a war, you needed to organize an army, train it, and you needed to feed it, and you needed to provide it with weapons, and that's just not cheap. And so if you were careless about sending your soldiers into war, you were careless about money, and you ran out of money very quickly, and you ran out of money, you lost your wars, and you got overrun and conquered by others. So that made war expensive, and it made leaders and kings and presidents think a lot before sending soldiers into war. In that kind of world, defensive war would be popular. If somebody invades your country, people in your country would get together and they would want to defend. They would want to contribute money, weapons, or their own selves to conscription in order to try and defend the country. But if you're launching an offensive war, trying to conquer land abroad, it's very difficult to convince people to go and die for the king to have more and more land. So this tended to make conflict a little bit more expensive over time, and it made governments more responsible. And over time, the more responsible ones succeeded more, and the less responsible ones lost and got taken over and went bankrupt and got destroyed. So this was all going very well, but it all changed in 1914. Now, before 1914, we did have times in which governments went off the gold standard to fight a war. It happened often, and it was devastating and it was destructive. But eventually, it had to end previously, because one country being off the gold standard was unsustainable. All the other countries were on the gold standard. And so the country that goes off the gold standard individually during a war ends up suffering economically. And so they have to reverse this decision. But that changed in 1914 with World War I, because all the major economies went off the gold standard. And so they could all inflate at the same time, and they managed to finance the war effort for a very long time. And that really made war permanent. It made the First World War last for a very long time, but beyond that, even after that, after the war ended, the natural state of a government was that it was now running a money printer and capable of fighting wars for a very long time. The distinction here is simple. When you have a money printer, you go to war, and you can keep printing money until the value of all the money held by everybody in the country is destroyed. When you didn't have a money printer, when money was gold, you could only fight for as long as you had gold in your own treasury. So the government could only fight for as long as it had gold. Once it ran out of gold, it could no longer fight. Now, with a money printer, it's not about how much gold the government has. It's about how much wealth the entire country has. And so the government takes the wealth away from people just by simply devaluing their money, and therefore it can keep fighting a war for a much, much longer time, and it can keep financing the war for a longer time, and it can keep conscripting people and forcing them to go to the front for a much longer time. And that's why World War I lasted so long, and that's why since then war has become a lot easier. It's more it's easier to just take people to war. You no longer need the consent of the people to be sent, because you have their money. You control their wealth, you can take their wealth, and then you force them to go. You make them poor if they don't go. And even taxation is no longer needed for war. It used to be that you had to tax people, which is unpopular. If you wanted to ask them for money, you'd go and you tell them, give me money, I want to send you to war. They hide the money, and then it's complicated to go after them and try and find where their money is. But if their money is fiat and you can print their money, doesn't matter if they hide it. Doesn't matter how well they hide it. Their money is being devalued because you're printing more of it. So you're taking their purchasing power, whether they know it or not. So you can pay for the soldiers to go to the war, whether the people want to pay for it or not. So what people think and what people say and how people vote become increasingly irrelevant in this world. Democracy becomes irrelevant. people's will and consent become irrelevant. You just print money and you tell them what's going to happen, and they have to deal with it. And if they don't like it, they are going to be impoverished to enforce it. Their wealth is going to go to make it happen, whether they like it or not. And the end result is that it's just now considered normal for many governments that, for many people, that their governments are just constantly at war. We see this all over the world. So how did this exactly happen in World War I? Why was World War I the point at which the monetary system really shifted from being on gold to being on fiat? Well, you know, the common myth is that most of those governments wanted to fight wars. Every government says it was a matter of life and death. We had to do it. And if we didn't do it, we would all get destroyed by the evil enemies. But they all did it at the same time. And they all went off the gold standard. They all increased the money supply massively. And in fact, there was a lot less public support for this war than most history books would like to tell you. And in fact, the most interesting story for me is the story of Britain, how Britain joined the war, because Britain at that time had the Bank of England, which was the world's central bank. It was really the world's first central bank at that time, because the whole world used to deal with the Bank of England, and it was the world's reserve currency. It was like the dollar today. So why did Britain get into war? Why did Britain sacrifice its position as the world leader, militarily and economically and in its empire, in order to go fight a war on the European mainland against its very, very powerful enemies and allies? Why would it get involved in this? It's a very interesting question. And if you look at it, you'll see that it was actually very different from the story that is usually told. So, usually, you know, historians like to say, well, Britain's hand was forced because of the invasion of Belgium and they had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. None of that is true. In reality, Britain wanted to fight the war. In reality, the King of Britain wanted to fight the war, and he spent years getting into a secret alliance with France and Russia in order to convince them to attack Germany so that Britain would enter Germany. And in fact, they deliberately lied repeatedly in order to make this happen. They denied that there was a secret alliance in order to make it happen, and in order to make it so that Germany would not think that Britain would enter the war, thus Germany would enter the war. So they lied about the causes of war, and then most importantly, they lied about the financing of the war. In fact, to get just how incredibly unlikely the war was, when the Crown Prince of Austria was assassinated in Serbia in 1914, on the same day in which he was assassinated, the British and German navies were partying together in Kiel in the north of Germany, when there was a week celebration where the Kaiser of Germany attended and the British Navy attended, and the two navy and the two soldiers of both navies were partying together over that night when the news of the assassination came. And then the celebrations ended. And when they left, the King of Britain, King George at that time, left a message to the people of Germany saying, "Friends today, friends in future, friends forever." This was June 28, 1914. Within 5 weeks, those two navies were at war with each other. How did this happen? It's an incredible story. In fact, for 4 weeks after the assassination was not even discussed in the British Parliament. It was considered a completely inconsequential matter of Europeans fighting with one another, had nothing to do with the British. And then within 1 week, Britain was in war. The British Prime Minister did not expect that he could ever be dragged into war. But that's exactly what happened. And in fact, when more recently we've seen some of the documents come out, it's very clear that the British were setting it up as a trap. In fact, the King of Britain was trying everything to make that war happen without the British people finding out. But how could he pull it off? How could he manage to do that without a vote in Parliament, without the people agreeing with it? Well, it's because he had the money printer. And this is what actually happened. In 1914, there was a bank run on the Bank of England, and the Bank of England only had 31% of the gold it needed to back its currency. People started asking for their money. The bank didn't have enough money. So what did they do? Run the money printer. 300 million pounds were printed in August of 1914. And then, as the money supply increased, they suspended the redemption of gold. They told people they can't get their gold. So basically they went off the gold standard, of course, because now they can't give them gold. And then they tried to borrow. And so they ran a bond auction. And they tried to raise 350 million pounds for that bond auction. which was 55% of the public debt. So imagine the public debt going up 55% over a war. It was a huge bond sale, and with an attractive interest rate. And they thought, of course, the British people are going to buy it, but to their eternal credit, the people of Britain actually did not buy it. In fact, less than a third of the bonds were sold, and fewer than 100,000 investors in all of Britain, out of a population of 46 million, fewer than 100,000 people invested in those bonds to fund World War I. But the army was already at war. So what do? People don't want to pay for the war, but you already sent the army to war. You hate when that happens, right? It really sucks. I know, happens to the best of us. But don't worry, there's a way to fix this. What is it? Fiat, of course. Fiat fixes this. If you ever find yourself in a war with no money, don't worry, Fiat fixes this. Just run the money printer. And in fact, what they did back then was truly astounding, because the Bank of England just extended a credit line to 2 of its employees who went and bought the bonds with their own bank accounts. They went and bought roughly 2/3 of the bond issue to fund British entry into World War I was bought by 2 guys. 2 guys got Britain into World War I. Of course, they worked at the Bank of England, so they got the credit line from the Bank of England. So the Bank of England printed a ton of hundreds of millions of pounds to them, more than the public debt of all Britain, and they used it to buy the bonds that made the war possible in 1914. And the next day, the Financial Times, the original shitcoin promotional telegram group of its time, published same thing, same shit they do today, promoting all of the central bank propaganda and all of the central bank shitcoins and scams. They said it was oversubscribed, 250 million pounds more than what the government wanted to raise. People have bought these bonds with so much enthusiasm. We're going to war. Everything is great. That's what the Financial Times published. And then, of course, this only was found out in 2017. 103 years later, some people were digging around in the attic of the Bank of England, and they found a detailed study that is confidential, that was prepared in the 1920s, detailing everything that the Bank of England did during 1914, and it became clear that, in fact, the bond was not oversubscribed. And the Financial Times ran a correction 103 years later. They ran a retraction. You can see it in 2017. So what did they do then? They printed all that money, and they bought all these bonds. So of course they had to stop people from using gold, because if people continued to use gold, the paper money would collapse in value. So they stopped people from using gold. They took the gold from people, they confiscated the gold, and they gave people paper, and more and more and more and more paper. And they collected the gold and they sent it to the US for credit, and that's how the British entered the war. And by getting the US involved in the lending for the war, they made it so that the US now had a vested interest in the war, and in particular in Britain winning the war. So that's how part of the reason why the US would later join the war, because they were lending Britain, and if Britain had lost, the loans would be gone. So it's just one lie after another, and it's just a series of terrible consequences snowballing one after the other, and that's how we end up with hundreds of millions of people dead in violent conflict over the last century. This one lie continuing to propagate, really. And it completely upends our understanding of the war. It changes the way that we think of the war. And it's basically completely ignored by modern historians. Modern historians don't discuss this. It's actually remarkable. It's been out, this news has been out for 7-8 years. You'd think all of the historians that write about it would be interested in it. But, modern historians, they don't like to talk bad things about governments and government financing and central banks, because central banks pay their bills. Generally don't talk bad things about people who pay your bills. And that's why historians and economists don't talk about this. So Britain entering the war is a big deal, because this is likely why the war happened. If Britain had stayed out, France and Russia would likely not have intervened in Serbia. In fact, the assassination itself would likely not have happened. I think this is pretty controversial. There's no evidence that the Russians instigated the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but there's no solid evidence, but there's a lot to hint at it. And because Britain was entering, but it was secretly entering. It hadn't announced that it was entering, and because they were telling the Germans we're friends forever a few weeks earlier, that's why Germany went into the war. If they knew that Britain would enter, they probably wouldn't have entered. So this lie has been an enormously devastating lie that has shaped our history over the last century and caused so much suffering. It has been a disaster for Britain. It's a disaster for the world. Britain went bankrupt effectively and has been constantly failing as a state since then. It used to be the world's dominant force. Today it's constantly regressing and becoming more and more broke and bankrupt and inflationary. Prices rose after World War I. There was a huge recession, and the problems of the 1920s followed, which led to the inflation of the 20s, which led to the Great Depression, which eventually led to World War II. All of that snowballing from that terrible inflation. And this was essentially how fiat money functions. This is how fiat money gets installed as a protocol. Governments spend too much, and then they default by confiscating and restricting the movement of gold. They suspend the redemption of gold, they increase the supply of paper notes, and then if they can, they try to get other countries to hold their reserve currencies. So because of this, because everybody's got this, everybody's got the money printed, and everybody's restricting the movement of gold, everybody now has the ability to fight a lot more. War. And that's why people think of war as normal. That's why people think of war as even a good thing. Some people even think that fighting war is good. You know, Americans think they're fighting wars for oil, as if, you know, their military needs to go die in the Middle East in order for them to have oil, which, you know, it will be news for people who live in places like Switzerland or Ecuador or Kenya, who don't have to go and invade the Middle East in order to get oil, and still they get oil. Miracle, right? Turns out it's not actually for oil, but it does work. So, now, interestingly enough, one of the people who was involved in that cover-up by the Bank of England of buying the bonds is a certain guy called John Maynard Keynes. You may have heard of him. They teach about him in school, and they tell you that he's a good guy and he's a smart guy. Well, he wasn't. He was an evil pedophile who raped children for entertainment, among many other horrible things that he did. Yes. And one of the things that he said, you know, he was so impressed with this, he called it a masterly manipulation. He was so fond of this. We're going to finance war without people even finding out. He was really excited about it. And he said one thing, he wrote a letter about it that was a confidential, that was also discovered just a few years ago. And in it he said, the capacity of the Bank of England to continue to lend depends on how much money people are leaving at the bank. If people leave a lot of gold at the bank, then the bank can continue to lend to the government and keep the war going. But if people take out their gold from the bank, then the printing is likely to cause a lot more inflation, and people are going to likely ask for their gold back, and that's going to devalue the money. So in order for this scam to work, people have to leave their money and their gold at the bank. Well, that then forces us to ask a very, very interesting question. Well, what would have happened if people had actually took their money out of the bank? What would have happened if people had an alternative mechanism for trading internationally? If they could move their gold to trade with one another and to trade across borders without having to go through banks and central banks. If they had that in 1914 and 1915, then likely the governments wouldn't have been able to continue with the inflation that would have kept the war going. If the gold could move without governments in 1914, humanity could have rugged the central banks and ended the war. Now, we know something that can move money around very quickly. Bitcoin, right? But unfortunately, 100 years ago, it was difficult to create a Bitcoin. But the premise of imagining something like Bitcoin in 1915 during World War I can help us think about what the world would have looked like. And that basically is the premise of my new book, The Gold Standard. What would have happened if something like the Bitcoin basically existed in 1914-15 and allowed government and allowed individuals to take their money out of the hands of central banks, and thus made it hard for central banks to inflate the money supply, causing this collapse of money supply, the collapse of fiat money. That's essentially what happens in this book in 1915. History takes a fork where instead of the war continuing for another 4 years of death, destruction, and devastation, we get this wonderful, beautiful machine. This is the Bitcoin of 1915, basically. Imagine in 1915 if the pioneers of aviation tried to, instead of suing each other, which is what they were doing at that time, If they decided, all right, let's find a commercial application of aviation, instead of trying to keep making money out of each other, let's find a commercial use. Let's do what Henry Ford did for cars. And in this case, you know, with airplanes at that time, it was very expensive to move people around, so it wasn't a likely viable business model to transport people. And even with goods, it was likely not a very viable model to move goods around, because goods are pretty heavy. If you're going to move something around economically at that stage, it would have to be something that's very, very, very valuable per unit of weight, which obviously makes it obvious that there's only one thing that is the most valuable: gold. So if you set up a business for clearing gold with airplanes in 1911, then that allows people to have essentially a decentralized monetary system where they can move their money around without having to trust in their local banks and central banks. If we had built that in 1911, 1912, then by 1914, 15, when the war started and the central banks started inflating, people would have had a choice. People would have taken their gold out. The fiat currencies would have collapsed. And that's the premise of the story that I have. In this book, central banks all collapse in 1915. The war, First World War, ends, and then empire and war are no longer affordable. Neutral countries like Switzerland and Holland, who, to your credit, everybody here, well done for staying out of World War I. Read this, seriously, tap yourself on the back. And in this book, Holland and Switzerland, they don't go into the World War I, and then all the neutral countries, they essentially become the superpowers of the world, because they didn't get bankrupt, they didn't lose all their gold, and they had all the gold from the other countries come to them. So, based on this, we get a new world order around the gold standard. So now, 1916, basically, the world is back on a gold standard, but it's a lot better gold standard than the previous one, because it's a lot more decentralized. There are no central banks. There's no inflation. So then, what would have happened? How would the century have looked like? Well, we would have had free trade. We would have had monetary freedom. People would have had freedom to use money that was not inflationary. There would be no inflation. There would be a lot less war, a lot less conflict, a lot less ability for governments to murder people, and a lot more freedom, a lot more abundance, a lot more capital accumulation. Think about all of the capital that was wasted on war and death and destruction over the last century. Imagine if governments couldn't steal that from us, and instead we could spend it and invest it on the things that we want. How different, how much more prosperous the world would have been. So I've spent the last year and a half basically trying to answer this question and come up with this story, which I hope you will enjoy. But before anybody gets angry and says, you know, Saif is now becoming a gold bug and he's going to start acting like Peter Schiff and telling us to buy gold, don't worry, this is still a Bitcoin book. Orange slides back to orange from yellow. This is still a Bitcoin book because ultimately, for the purposes of this thought experiment, we made it so that gold moved around. But really, let's face it, it's very difficult to move gold around. It's a lot easier to move Bitcoin around. In the real world, Bitcoin still wins this war between gold and Bitcoin. Bitcoin remains our only chance of breaking out of this. Central banks captured gold before it could escape, and now they can always capture it, they can always neuter it, they can always stop it from being free money. But they don't have the ability to control Bitcoin, and they cannot capture Bitcoin. If we move to gold, they will rug us again, just like they've rugged us before, and they keep their wars going. If we move to gold, they will rug us again and keep the wars going. But if we go to Bitcoin, it's over. They cannot rug us. We will rug them. It's over. No more wars. Game over. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My books are available. My books are available outside at the hall. There's still a whole bunch left. If you guys want to come pick your copy up now, and I'm signing them. Thank you so much.
And that concludes tonight's broadcast with Saifedean Ammous. A reminder that money is never just money. It is policy. It is power. And too often, it is permission. If fiat can be printed in the heat of crisis, then crisis becomes the business model. But if money is scarce, the war machine meets its limit. If this segment stirred something in you, keep that feeling. Let it sharpen your discernment. Until then, stay steady, stay sovereign. This is Hopium Radio.
This is Hopium Radio, your #1 radio station, your favorite source of dopamine hits for your Bitcoin bullishness. Broadcasting every day on the internet, where every dip is healthy, every pump is inevitable, and every chart is somehow confirming the thesis. No financial advice, just conviction and bull speeches strong enough to make you whisper, "I'm never selling," like it's a bedtime prayer. So whether you're up 12% and feeling chosen, or down 25% and suddenly a philosopher, you're in the right place. Lock in, turn it up, and stack sats responsibly, irresponsibly, because you're tuned in to Hopium Radio, where the signal is strong and the positivity is borderline toxic.
I was a big believer in bitcoins. I believe in this thing. I think this is the way money should work. Telegram is a money-losing operation for me personally. Bitcoin is something that allowed me to stay afloat. The governments keep printing money like no tomorrow. Nobody's printing Bitcoin.
You're listening to Hopium Radio.
Good evening, and welcome to Hopium Radio, where conviction travels best through warm static and timeless air. Tonight's broadcast comes from Pavel Durov in conversation with Lex Fridman, a dialogue on freedom, discipline, and the quiet courage to live without fear. From growing up between two worlds to standing firm against greed and pressure, Durov speaks with a rare kind of clarity, the kind that costs something and is therefore worth something. And then the signal turns to Bitcoin, not as a trade, not as a trend, but as an idea. Money that cannot be confiscated, censored, or printed into meaninglessness. Settle in. Keep your pace steady. Here is Pavel Durov.
You've been an advocate for freedom for many years, writing that you should be ready to risk everything for freedom. What were some influences and insights that helped you arrive at this value of human freedom?
I get to experience the difference between a society with freedom and a society without freedom pretty early in life. I was 4 years old when my family moved from the Soviet Union to northern Italy, and I could see that a society without freedom cannot enjoy the abundance of opinions, of ideas, of goods and services. Even for a 4 or 5 year old kid, it was obvious. Like, you can't experience all the toys, the ice cream sorts, the cartoons in the Soviet Union that you could access in Italy. And then I got to realize something even more important. You don't get to contribute to this abundance without freedom. And at this point, it was pretty obvious to me.
You also wrote "Svoboda важнее денег," translates to "freedom matters more than money." How do you prevent these values for freedom being corrupted by money, by people with influence, by people with power?
Well, the biggest enemies of freedom are fear and greed. So you make sure that they don't stand in your way. If you imagine the worst thing that can happen to you, and then make yourself be comfortable with it, there's nothing more left to be afraid of. So you stand your ground, and you remember that it's worth living your life according to the principles that you believe in, even though this life can end up being shorter than a longer life, but lived in slavery.
Do you contemplate your mortality? You think about your death?
Oh yes.
You afraid of it?
In a way, you have to go against your instinct of self-preservation. And it's not easy. We are all biological beings, hard-coded to be afraid of death. Nobody wants to die. But when you approach it rationally, you live and then you die. There's no such thing as your death in your life. You stop experiencing life once you die. So you have to ask yourself this question: is it worth living a life full of fear of death? Or it's much more enjoyable to forget about this and live your life in a way that makes you immune to this fear, at the same time remembering that death exists, so that every day would count.
Yeah, remembering that death exists makes you deeply feel every moment that you do get.
That's why I love reminding myself that I can die any day.
In many ways, you live a pretty stoic existence. I got a chance to spend a couple of weeks with you. In many ways, you seek to minimize the negative effects of the outside world on your mind. You've written, quote, "If you want to reach your full potential and maintain clarity of mind, stay away from addictive substances. My success and health are the result of 20 plus years of complete abstinence from alcohol, tobacco, coffee, pills, and illegal drugs. Short-term pleasure isn't worth your future." Let's talk about each one of these. Alcohol. What's been your philosophy behind that?
That one is quite easy. When I was 11 years old, my biochemistry teacher, he gave me this book he wrote. It was called The Illusion of Paradise. And there he would describe the biological and chemical processes that happen in your body once you consume this or that substance. It was mainly related to illegal drugs, but alcohol was one of these addictive substances that he covered. So it turns out that when you drink alcohol, the thing that happens is that your brain cells become paralyzed. They become literally zombies. And then next day, sometime after the party is over, some of your brain cells die and never get to normal. So think about it, if your brain is this most valuable tool you have in your journey to success and happiness, why would you destroy this tool for short-term pleasure? This sounds ridiculous. And I just threw a couple of millions there. And a lot of people after Bitcoin later next year went down, somewhere close to 300, 200, started to express their sympathy to me. They say, "Oh, you poor fellow, you made this horrible mistake investing in this new thing, but don't feel bad about it. We still have some respect for you." And my response to them was, "I don't care, I'm not going to sell it. I believe in this thing. I think this is the way money should work. Nobody can confiscate your Bitcoin from you. Nobody can censor you for political reasons. This is the ultimate means of exchange." And again, I'm now talking about Bitcoin, but it relates to cryptocurrencies in general. So I have been able to fund my lifestyle, so to say, from my Bitcoin investment. Some people think if I'm able to rent nice locations or fly private, it's because I somehow extract money from Telegram. But like I said, Telegram is a money-losing operation for me personally. Bitcoin is something that allowed me to stay afloat. And I believe it will come to a point when Bitcoin is worth $1 million. Just look at the trends. The governments keep printing money like no tomorrow. Nobody's printing Bitcoin. There is a predictable inflation and then it stops at a certain point. Bitcoin is here to stay. All the fiat currencies remains to be seen.
That was Pavel Durov with Lex Fridman on freedom, discipline, and Bitcoin as uncensorable money. Tune in for the next segment as we continue the signal, right here on Hopium Radio.
This is Hopium Radio, your #1 radio station, your favorite source of dopamine hits for your Bitcoin bullishness. Broadcasting every day on the internet where every dip is healthy, every pump is inevitable, and every chart is somehow confirming the thesis. No financial advice, just conviction and bull speeches strong enough to make you whisper, "I'm never selling," like it's a bedtime prayer. So whether you're up 12% and feeling chosen, or down 25% and suddenly a philosopher, you're in the right place. Lock in, turn it up, and stack sats responsibly, irresponsibly, because you're tuned in to Hopium Radio, where the signal is strong and the positivity is borderline toxic.
You're listening to Hopium Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's broadcast features Andreas Antonopoulos, one of Bitcoin's most trusted teachers. A clear and uncompromising voice for sound money, Andreas has spent the last decade making Bitcoin understandable to ordinary people through his talks, books, and patient explanations, always focused on freedom, sovereignty, and the power of an open network. Now, settle in. Andreas Antonopoulos.
Good morning, everyone. Let's start with a quick poll here. How many of you have used a digital currency like Bitcoin at least once? And how many of you own Bitcoin at this moment, or any other digital currency? Okay, we can fix that. If you like, later on today, come find me. I would be delighted to demonstrate to you how to set up a Bitcoin wallet on your smartphone, and I will give you your first fraction of a Bitcoin, not a whole Bitcoin, and show you how a transaction works. Because Bitcoin and the digital currency revolution it has started is best demonstrated and experienced than explained. It's actually very difficult to explain Bitcoin. I've spent the last 5 years learning how to explain Bitcoin. That is my full-time job. Unfortunately, the developers keep making new stuff, which I then have to explain all over again. So, for a moment, forget everything you think you know about Bitcoin. Forget everything you've heard about blockchain, and let's start from basics. In 2011, I heard about Bitcoin for the first time, and my reaction was exactly the same as the reaction of everybody else who heard about Bitcoin the first time, including its founder, and that reaction was, ha! Nerd money. That's probably just for gambling. 6 months later, I heard about Bitcoin again. And this time, I read the white paper that launched this system. And my background in computer science and distributed systems allowed me to see behind the illusion of what I thought Bitcoin was, and it blew my mind. In my life, I have now had 6 occasions in which I have become absolutely obsessed with a system of technology to the point of forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep, and consuming as much knowledge as I possibly can. My first computer, when I was 10 years old, my first programming language experience, my first modem, my first access to the web, the first time I used the web browser, the first time I downloaded and installed the Linux operating system, and then Bitcoin. When I've discovered it, I spent 4 months consuming as much as I could, except food. I lost 26 pounds on the highly inadvisable diet of obsession. I have not emerged from that because I keep finding new layers of depth to understand this. And the reason it's so fascinating is because it isn't what it appears to be at first glance. Bitcoin isn't money. The blockchain isn't a system of currency. It is a platform of trust. It's not a company. It's not a product. It's not a service you sign up for. It's not a currency. Currency is just the first application. It is the concept of decentralization applied to the human communication of value. Because what is money? InQ told us it's an illusion. It's imaginary. And the reason we don't grasp that is because it's so deeply embedded in our civilization. Money is one of the oldest technologies that humanity has. It precedes writing. How do we know that? The very first samples of writing we have are spreadsheets. They are tallies and ledgers of debts owed, and money pre-existed that writing. You might even speculate that money had an oral tradition until it needed to invent a written tradition, so writing was created for it. In the history of money that now spans tens of thousands of years, there have been maybe 5 major changes. From pure barter exchange to the introduction of the first abstraction of value, shells, feathers, beads, nuts, stones, and then precious metals, and then paper money, and then plastic money, and now network money. Bitcoin introduces a platform on which you can run currency as an application on a network without any central points of control, a system completely decentralized like the internet itself. It is not money for the internet, but the internet of money. And what is money? Money is a language. Money is a linguistic abstraction. Money is a language that we use to communicate value to each other. Money simply allows us to express value, and that value may have economic consequences, but it also has other consequences. We use money to express and create social bonds and relationships and associations and to create organization. Bitcoin is the first system of money that is not controlled by any entity, that is completely decentralized. And what that does is it introduces the very same things that the internet brought to communication. If money is speech, if money is a language, and you disconnect it from all other media, and you make it pure speech, pure content, an internet content type, a protocol designation, money over IP, it completely separates it from all of these previous notions of nations, sovereign issuers, institutions that control. And so we go from institution-based money to network-based money. And of course, everyone will welcome this with open arms. Not a chance. What do you think they said the first time someone was presented with a gold depository certificate instead of a gold coin? They said, "That's not money. Go away." What do you think happened in 1950, the first time someone showed up at a motel and presented their Diners Club membership card and said, "I'll pay with this piece of paper"? That's not money. Go away. And now we're on the verge of a new transformation of money. We're on the verge of creating the first completely global, completely borderless, completely decentralized, and completely open form of money. One where you can build applications because this money is programmable. And you don't need to ask anyone's permission to launch an application any more than you need to ask permission to launch an application on the internet. And the only requirement to have a successful application on the Internet of Money is 2 interested participants. That is your market segment, and you have an application. And 1 million applications will flourish. When you push innovation to the edges of the network, when you remove the requirement for permission, what happens? Exponential explosion in innovation. The applications that could not be built on the old systems of money because they required permission, because they required a significantly large market segment, because they required adoption by many in order to be available at all. Now, none of those requirements exist. Anyone in the world can download an application or use even a feature phone with text messaging and immediately acquire the same powers that institutions of banking have today. And when I say anyone, that's only scratching the surface. Because, ironically enough, not only does Bitcoin and blockchain currency not recognize borders, it also does not recognize people. It doesn't matter if you're a person, or a refrigerator, or a self-driving car. Throughout the history of money, ownership of currency required personhood, either as an individual or as an association of individuals in a corporation. Bitcoin can be owned by machines. Bitcoin can be owned by software agents. Machines can pay each other. And that is not just about economic activity. It's the basis for market-based security systems. It's the basis for creating bonds of authentication between devices. It's the basis of new applications that have never been done before. Bitcoin and blockchain technology unifies the systems of money. Today we have systems of money for small payments, systems of money for large payments. We have systems of money for payments between individuals. We have systems of money for payments between companies. We have systems of money for payments between governments. Does that remind you of something? That's how communication used to be before the internet. We had systems of communication for pictures, systems of communication for letters, systems of communication for short distance and long distance, and the internet came and unified all of those. What the Internet of Money does is it creates a single network which can do a microtransaction to a gigatransaction in seconds, anywhere in the world, for any participant without permission. But if you just look at the application of money, you're missing the point. Because you can take the language, the building blocks of this platform, and use them to construct other languages that communicate value. Tokens, reward points, brand loyalty coins. Today there are over 1,000 digital currencies using the design pattern, the recipe of Bitcoin. Most of them are junk. Some of them are not. And over the next decade, we are going to see tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of coins. Some will have economic use, some will simply be expressions of loyalty, affiliation. They will represent items in the physical world. The title for a house, the controlling key for a car that can be transferred from one owner to another, and 5 seconds later that owner can step into the car and drive away because the car can validate the new standard of ownership. We cannot yet imagine what applications we're going to build around this. But one of the interesting things we're beginning to observe is that money arises out of the social construct of Homo sapiens spontaneously. It even arises in primates. You can teach monkeys money. You can teach dolphins money. You can teach greys, parrots, money. And they will learn how to exchange abstract tokens for food and then use them to build social relationships. They'll also invent strong-arm robbery. Beat up the other monkey, take away its pebbles, eat the bananas. And we see that same thing happen in children. Toddlers invent money in kindergarten. Blocks and rubber bands and Pokemon cards and other little tokens, abstractions of value that they exchange to strengthen social bonds, to express loyalty and friendship, to learn about sharing. Children will be building currencies. Only this time these currencies will be global, unforgeable, and scalable on day one. A few years from now, Maria will be launching Maria Coin in her kindergarten to compete against Joey Coin. And it won't really matter to anyone. Until, of course, Justin Bieber launches Justin Bieber Coin, and it happens to surpass the market capitalization of 30 nations on this planet. And we are all writing horrified opinion editorials about how the world is going to hell. What's happening with this technology is astonishingly deep. And for certainly some of the companies in this room, it's a bit scary. Banking has never been the most innovative sector in the world because there is a very careful balance between innovation and the conservative fiduciary duty that exists in banking, that must exist when you control other people's money. And yet with Bitcoin, you don't control other people's money. In Bitcoin, I control my money. I have complete and total authority over my Bitcoin. It cannot be seized, it cannot be frozen, it cannot be censored, my transactions cannot be intercepted, and they cannot be stopped. And I can do so with almost complete anonymity, and so can anyone 5 minutes after they download an application, and money has changed forever, and banking has changed forever. The idea that you can proceed in the industry of money, in the industries of commerce, and maintain the same conservative attitude that has existed now for centuries, ever since merchants in Venice and Amsterdam started issuing depository certificates and providing banking services. That is gone. That is gone. You cannot operate closed systems that have borders and require permission to join at a rate of innovation that is controlled by the most conservative tendencies within your organization, because now you are competing with a technology that enables exponential growth, exponential innovation at the edges without permission by anyone in the world. And it's not about anyone in this room. Why? We represent the privileged elite. I can go onto a brokerage account, open it up online, and be trading on the Tokyo stock market within 12 hours in yen. That is the privilege that I have. 1.5 billion people have that privilege. 6 billion people can operate mainly in one currency and perhaps have some basic banking services. 4 billion people are significantly underbanked, and an astonishing 2.5 billion people are completely unbanked. They will leapfrog. They will never have a relationship with a bank. Every single child born today will never have a bank account. They will have a bank app. A bank app that doesn't give them an account, a bank app that makes them a banker, an international banker in an app. They will not be permitted to open a bank account until they're 16 years old. By that time, I hope they will have at least 6 or more years of experience with digital currencies. And I would like to watch them walk into a bank branch to have someone explain to them what 3 to 5 business days means. It is highly likely that children born today will never get a driving license because they'll have self-driving cars, but they will also never use paper money. Because by the time they get to an age where they really start using money, there is no paper money. It will seem as anachronistic as a fax machine or horse and buggy seems to us. Exponential innovation on a global basis, giving access to the other 6 billion. They have enormous need, and this system offers them a solution. It's not ready yet. It's nascent. It's complex. It's impossible to use for most people. In 1989, I sent my first email. In order to do so, I had to compile a version of the Unix mail program using a C compiler and Unix command line skills. I had to set it up on the command line, type out my email, and that email was transmitted across the great internet in an astonishing 3 days. Exactly 20 years later, my mother replicated that experience with a swipe. Bitcoin today, and all of the currencies that are built on that recipe, are just at the same level that the internet was in 1991. Only now, we have the internet. And so the rate of exponential growth has already started. The innovation is growing at an astonishing rate. I spend every single day full-time trying to keep up with Bitcoin. Just one currency, and it's almost impossible. Do not underestimate this. Do not listen to the people who tell you that Bitcoin is just for pornographers, terrorists, drug dealers, and gamblers. Remember that they said the exact same thing about the internet. And when you give it to 2 or 3 billion people, they're not interested in those things. They're interested in sharing cat videos. And now we have an internet of 1 billion cat videos. When you take digital currency mainstream and give it to the 4 billion people who have been isolated from international finance and commerce, and you give them the opportunity to control their money against despotic governments and corrupt banks that are stealing from them, you give them the opportunity to control their future. You give them the opportunity to transact with everyone in the world, to own title on their own property in a fully transferable digital token that is recognized everywhere. Control over finance that cannot be seized, frozen, or censored. They will buy food, healthcare, sanitation, education, shelter, because that's what we do. And they will not be denied this technology. Do not underestimate where this is going. The Internet of Money was launched on January 3rd, 2009. It's coming. It's coming faster than you can imagine. It's deeper than you can fathom. It's more sophisticated than you can immediately understand. It takes years of study just to see all of the implications. and it is a gift to the entire world, a technology that represents the sixth greatest innovation in the technology of money, the most ancient technology of our civilization. Thank you.
And that brings our session with Andreas to a close. If his words left you thinking a little deeper about freedom, responsibility, and the quiet power of an open network, then the signal did its work. Stay tuned for the next broadcast as we continue our journey through Bitcoin's most enduring voices, right here on Hopium Radio.
This is Hopium Radio, your #1 radio station, your favorite source of dopamine hits for your Bitcoin bullishness. Broadcasting every day on the internet where every dip is healthy, every pump is inevitable, and every chart is somehow confirming the thesis. No financial advice, just conviction and bull speeches strong enough to make you whisper, "I'm never selling," like it's a bedtime prayer. So whether you're up 12% and feeling chosen, or down 25% and suddenly a philosopher, you're in the right place. Lock in, turn it up, and stack sats responsibly, irresponsibly, because you're tuned in to Hopium Radio, where the signal is strong and the positivity is borderline toxic.